In this part 2 of our series, Professor Hoeller looks at how a theosophical life might best be viewed as a hero's journey.
Stephan, perhaps you could begin by introducing us to the myth of the hero's journey.
It would appear that the hero's journey is really, in many ways, the principle or the monomyth of the Western tradition and the Western culture. We are an outgoing, sort of energetic and ambitious culture, has taken quite early in its history the hero as its example. Now, there are different variations of that, but it almost always involves the beginning in a more, in a state of, you might say, confused innocence, and then going through various experiences of learning and training, various reversals, major ordeal, and then eventually the achievement of wholeness by, usually by way of rescuing some treasure, or sometimes the maiden in distress, which is symbolic of the achievement of the wholeness of the hero. And this, of course, has many different variations and can be applied in a variety of contexts.
Okay. I think you had a verse from, you said, the Gospel of Thomas that you think sort of sums that up?
Oh yes, in the very early portion of the Gospel of Thomas, there is a saying attributed to Jesus which runs as follows: "Let him who seeks keep seeking until he finds, and when he found, then he will be troubled, and when he has been troubled, he will marvel, and he will become a master over the all." And this, in an abbreviated form, I think is a very good statement of the hero's journey in the sense of the personal transformation of the individual.
Right, because the hero's journey is always the sort of personal transformative journey, not necessarily, well, it's outward in the world, but it's an inward process as well.
Yes, like all of the great myths, their outward representation really indicates internal transformative steps. Every myth, as we mentioned, I think, on the last occasion, has a personal, individual application. And when it doesn't have that, then it isn't really a very authentic myth. It isn't very good.
Okay. Well, let's take that statement from the Gospel of Thomas and sort of follow through and explore that, and then sort of see where that applies to various theosophical ideas. The
first stage in this particular hero's journey would be the seeking. Let him who seeks keep seeking. Now the seeking indicates, I think, in a very large measure an exit from the consensus reality of the world. Okay. And that generally indicates a bewilderment and a confusion and a meaninglessness on the part of the individual who has not found the kind of meaning that he or she desires in the reality of the world, and now seeks for something greater. And I think that's the way that most of us and most people, probably no matter in which period, found their way to organizations and spiritual systems such as Theosophy, because they were seeking for a greater amount of meaning.
So that whatever they'd grown up with or whatever they had before, some experience, perhaps reading the newspaper, perhaps something in their own lives, destroyed the view that they were comfortable with, and then they go out and seek.
I'm always reminded of a title of one of the medieval novels of the great French writer Zoe Oldenburg, which is entitled "The World Is Not Enough." Okay. At some point we all come to a measure of the realization that the world is not enough, and we seek for something more and something deeper. Mm-hmm. Now, however, comes the question: what happens when that seeking yields some results? Mm-hmm. And there, the issue in this case is that usually, in the case of our theosophical system, the seeker then is presented with a very impressive, very highly organized, internally consistent worldview, which at least apparently has an answer, and a fairly good one, to just about every question that one can ask. Okay. And this then does away to a certain extent with that chaos and that meaninglessness that the person has started out with. The hero's journey does not end at that point. The journey goes on. And this is something that we very often don't realize. There is a tendency to remain in a static position at that point and to merely be satisfied with all of these impressive answers and then use them as an ongoing plan for life, which is, has a certain justification, but often then the transformational growth could be arrested at that particular point. So it's needful to realize that one must also move on from there to a deepening of one's vision.
Okay, like it's oftentimes when people come and they've been in this questing state, they find the society and they talk about being thirsty, you know, drinking up these ideas, many of them the worldview in a sort of factual, literal sense like we talked about yesterday, gives them great meaning. They feel like they've found answers. And maybe we can explore some of those ideas that people find and want to read about or want to do more. One of the first ones that seems to come to mind is things like reincarnation and karma. Those are ideas within the Theosophical framework that have great meaning to people at first.
Oh yes, but I think that what we might undertake probably at this point, beginning with this issue, is to try to view some of these principal theosophical ideas or teachings, as they are often called, in an increasingly mythic light, trying to see whether they work as myths as well as teaching.
Okay.
And I think that what we might consider, for instance, that the theosophical myth is the myth of a journey. Okay. When we look at it from the cosmological, the larger picture in the macrocosmic sense, then that journey is probably represented by the evolutionary concept, what we called at another time the psychoneumatic evolution, not primarily biological evolution, that movement of consciousness through the various stages of development, root races and continents and all of that, onward and ever onward. When it comes to the individual, there we have the analog of that journey through the mythologems of reincarnation, aided by the concept of karma. So now the question is, what is reincarnation? Some people would say that, and have said and have written in so many words, that reincarnation is a fact. I would rather suggest that reincarnation is a myth. That's probably even a more reasonable proposition, because ironclad proof of reincarnation is again very, very difficult and well nigh impossible to come by. So but again, we need to remember that by saying that reincarnation is a myth, we are in no means saying that it is an untruth. We are merely saying that it is a truth at an other than merely factual level.
And how could one use that then in their own life, say, the idea of reincarnation as a myth, as opposed to, well, when I finish this and I've gathered everything up and then I go on to the next life? How would you use it as a mythic tool in this life?
I am not, I must confess, I am not a terribly big fan of reincarnation, which, however, possibly will not exempt me from the necessity of reincarnating if such should be the case. But its mythic value is there nevertheless. I think primarily it is a myth that allows one to see the journey extended.
I know in sort of current, the death and dying psychological
yes.
stuff, they talk about not so much maybe reincarnation, but that in life we have many deaths. And I wondered if you saw that as symbolic also of this mythic element, that things end, there's a period of rest, and you come back out again in that sort of cyclic fashion just through life's crisis.
Certainly the death and rebirth myth, as for instance exemplified probably particularly in Egypt by the story of Osiris and to some extent of Christ, is very compatible with this, because we might say that we also have several incarnations in one lifetime. And an awareness of the circumstances of one's life, or conscious life, will disclose that. And then if we extend the myth of reincarnation into a longer time period, then that merely shows the same principle continuing, the same principle that we experience in life already.
Okay, so there are other parts of the sort of theosophical worldview that when people are in this beginning stage, they've been questing and they now found it and they say, whew, it gives meaning, that we thought we might cover. Maybe talking about the angelic kingdoms or forces, invisible forces there that are available to help. That's a mythic element in the theosophical worldview.
Oh, well, of course, absolutely. Then now within that, let's say, within the theosophical myth of the hero, we have, of course, the issue of rebirth. We have the issue of the lawful parameters within which that rebirth takes place, which is symbolized by karma. We have, in addition to the human kingdom, the various other kingdoms as a sort of a distant goal of sorts. We have the superhuman development of the adepts, of the masters of the wisdom, as the assisting and encompassing agencies. We have the angelic kingdom. So we have a very rich cast of characters who are involved in the journey of the hero.
Okay. So what you're really saying, I think, is that when someone first finds Theosophy and starts reading it, if they're not reading it even in a mythic sense, they might find many ideas that are very comforting, that seem to bring meaning to their lives again. And then I think your point earlier was that after a while that doesn't work anymore.
Yes, quite, because the hero is a hero by virtue of the fact that the meeting of challenges, the overcoming of difficulties requires a heroic exertion of strength and of virtue. And so the hero must go on and meet greater challenges and not merely remain within the condition of that initial comfort.
Returning to what we were talking about before, it's almost that if we just accept that first view, as comforting as it is, we fall into the consensus reality of turning things into belief and dogma. Whereas if we don't, if we continue the journey, we stay in the alternative tradition. Is that
yes?
Is that right?
The alternative reality tradition has its own method, its own stratagem, which does not permit really the individual to become fixated at any one stage of development. And Buddha's famous statement is walk on, walk on. The disciple asks him various questions. What shall we do about this? What shall we do about that? He says, walk on. There is a very similar statement attributed to Christ in the Gospel of Thomas, wherein Christ says something very, very similar. Namely, be passers-by. So pass by all of these side issues and keep going. And so in a sense, we need to pass by our own beliefs, our own, at one time, very necessary and comforting belief system as well, not in the sense necessarily of discarding them as untrue, but in penetrating to greater depths beyond them.
And that's the meaning of the phrase in the poem or statement that you did first, that once you've found, you will be troubled.
You will be troubled. So it would seem then that after we have found the new world view, challenges and difficulties arise which stir up the soul and which also indicate a certain amount of trouble. So that if we expect just ever greater serenity and peace to arise out of our theosophical involvements, we are probably having a somewhat unrealistic expectation. Total peace of mind is a sign of death. And the cemeteries are singularly peaceful places, but I don't think that we really need that.
I think we were talking about the myth of the failed Messiah as sort of a part of what might lead us from that state of peace we think we've found it to what life can bring to us that means we have to move on. Would you?
Well, that's very interesting that you should mention that, because of course, as many people are aware, the Theosophical movement in a sense had its own failed Messiah who died just a few years ago, Mr. Krishnamurti. that was a great shock and remained a great puzzlement to a great many people, probably including ourselves. But it would seem that it's not even the story of Mr. Krishnamurti, in a sense, wasn't all that much difference from the story of the Judeo-Christian Messiah, Christ, and others, wherein, let us say, a saving, a helpful agency comes into the world and to our own lives, and we become very much attached to it, and we project our own expectations upon that. We want it to help us in a particular way, and it refuses to do that. One might say that where the Messiah fails us, we need to take up the role of messiahship for ourselves. So the external assisting agency is not going to do for us what we need to do ourselves. We then need to internalize it and to work with it ourselves. And this is one of the ways in which we become troubled. Now, we may not become attached to an individual messiah at this particular point, but even if we expect Theosophy, with its reincarnation and karma and with its evolution to sort of totally save us from all trouble and further challenges and just allow us to rest on a firm bedrock of truth from now on, I think we will find that that will become a failed messiah, largely by our own fault.
So it's really the personal dilemma we can face in many ways, the plans that we make that we sure are right is the right direction, going out that way, and it doesn't work. So we're thrown back on ourselves to continue and deepen our journey.
Yeah, I think also a lot of us expect firm guidelines and truths concerning the conduct of our lives, unvarying safe parameters of commandment from something like Theosophy. And of course there are some present there, but once again this is one of the great areas where the alternative reality tradition differs from the mainstream traditions, that in the kind of hero's journey that I feel Theosophy represents, we have to constantly reformulate and reforge our own program, our own rules, our own way of doing things. And we cannot just rest on an established rule, because that is what being conscious requires.
Okay. You know, at the risk of being sort of grim for a moment, before we get to the next stage of this journey, the myth of evil is one that really fits in here, right? Because in Theosophy, we sometimes think once we've found that worldview, everything is going to feel good from that point on.
Oh yes, because in the initial period of seeking, we have been bewildered by counterproductive and painful and evil things, and then when we are presented, let's say, with such concepts as karma, we feel that we have now overcome that. And popular expressions in theosophical circles such as perfect justice rules the world allow us to sort of shunt the issue of radical evil in the world aside. We pretend that it does not exist because everything is within law. Well, there are laws in our country, in our community too, but there is still evil. The law does not remove the existence of evil. And so one of our challenges, I feel, after a certain period is that we begin to recognize that there are conditions in our lives and in the world which cannot be really entirely accounted for by the perfect justice that rules the world. And so now we are confronted with the dark side of things again. And we are troubled thereby.
Yeah. Didn't you say that Blavatsky had quotes on that, something that she had to say about the imperfection?
Oh yes, I think it's generally assumed when we are just dealing with the theosophical myth at a rather superficial level, that we have a really relatively rosy picture of life. That everything is God, everything is the emanation of the Supreme, and since the one life, the hidden life, is essentially good, therefore everything is good, all things move toward the good, and there is a kind of inherent perfection and goodness and glory in all things, which is a very comforting thought. And I do not deny that entirely, but I think we find that in many of her writings, HPB did not have quite such a rosy view. For instance, she mentioned that while the one Godhead is infinite and unconditioned, the supreme goodness cannot create anything. It cannot make anything because it is abstract. And so when the creative power comes down to our own level, it undergoes an imperfection. And that therefore imperfection and flaws are inherent in our world and in ourselves. And that actually the Dhyan Chohans and various names that are mentioned in the secret doctrine are referred to her as the imperfect gods. For instance, she says, the millions upon millions of imperfect works found in nature testify loudly that they are the products of finite conditioned beings, though the latter were and are Dhyan Chohans, archangels, or whatever else they may be named. In short, these imperfect works are the unfinished product of evolution under the guidance of imperfect gods. So now, how does that go along with perfect justice rules the world and things of that sort? So we begin to again see the imperfection and the evil as existing in the world, and we have to account for that in some fashion. We can't really explain it away with karma. So now the myth of the dragon, the adversary, the evil, which plays such a great role in the myth of the hero, arises, and we must meet it. We may not have to slay the dragon all the time. Most of us don't like to kill anything unless we absolutely have to. Maybe a cockroach here and there or whatever. But we have to encounter, we have to confront them, and we cannot chase them away even under the auspices of some concepts such as the perfection and the perfect justice of the world.
So sort of implied in this theosophical myth of the journey is that we have to come to terms with, I think it said, as the limitations of matter or the limitations of manifestation. We have to acknowledge them in our lives, have to be aware of them. Then what happens?
The limitations of our own bodies, the limitations of human nature. Well, what happens, of course, after that, I think, is that we begin to inwardly, in consciousness, rise above those limitations. The recognition of limitation and even of evil compels us to see the deeper reasons. There's a wonderful little story that maybe I may tell very briefly that actually was told to me by a prominent Theosophist years ago. It's a Chinese story and has to do with a man who was sort of a seer of sorts in China and had, like a prodigal son, had wandered away from home and had lived in a very bad neighborhood among criminals and prostitutes and people of that sort. And they would come to him to sort of look at their spirit. And at first he would always see a frightful demon and get scared of that, and then he heard a voice telling him, look deeper. And then the face of the demon would change, and there would be always a more kindly face, and ultimately he always ended up with the image of Kuan Yin, the bodhisattva of compassion. So this is the kind of thing that the confrontation with the demon of darkness forces us to do. If we look deeper, we come to a recognition of the marvel. Then we begin to marvel at that greatness that exists beyond the conflict and the conflictual interaction of good and evil in the world, but not by denying that the conflict exists, but by rather being able to rise above it and look deeper.
We were talking, there are several things within the Theosophical worldview that might help us in that process of several things that can be seen as myths as well, that might help us in that process of confronting and moving beyond. One is the forms of meditation, perhaps, that don't emphasize peacefulness so much as being quiet and really seeing what's there.
Yes.
That's
oh,
one
absolutely,
set.
yes. Now what we are sort of talking about is how do we move from the being troubled state in the journey to the state where we marvel. Right. And obviously there must be some stratagems that help us to come to that state. And I think you are very correct that we are frequently rather enamored with the sorts of meditational exercises that appear to have a greater peace as their objective. And no doubt much meditation is a very good antidote to the turmoil and the hubbub and the confusion of this world. But there is also the sort of thing that might still be called meditation, which is really the awareness, the practicing of the awareness of the existential condition, even the awareness of conflict. That if we see the conflicts in our lives and in the world as they truly are, without projecting our wishes and fears into them or in various ways distorting them, but just perceiving them as they truly are, then the possibility of the resolution of these conflicts and the movement toward the greater understanding is thereby enhanced.
Another way of working with this is trying to find a modality or a strategy, as you called it, might be looking at psychological types. Perhaps we could look at the Jungian ones or the 7 rays, 7 schools of yoga.
Oh, very much so, because now let's be clear about it. I think that almost anyone would agree that some of the greatest, the most painful conflicts in our lives are interpersonal conflicts. It's personalities who are in conflict with each other. And that's what hurts us most greatly, because we are human beings who depend on each other. No man is an island, as it has been said, and I take it no woman either. And so what are these interpersonal conflicts really based on? They are based on the differences in character between humans. In fact, when C.G. Jung formulated his theory of psychological types, by his own admission, he was largely moved to do that by the very violent conflicts of opinion that existed in the psychoanalytic movement. And he found out, for instance, that people like Adler and Freud were of different psychological types. They never could agree on anything. I think in Theosophical history a similar story was told of H.P. Blavatsky and Anna Bonus Kingsford. Is that? Yeah.
Kingsford.
Yeah. Every time one said something, the other one reformulated in according to the other's frame of reference, because they were obviously very different psychological types. So when we understand that the interpersonal conflicts are due to the differences in temperament, in character, rather than that one is right and the other one is wrong, we are able to maybe put that famous theosophical brotherhood, sisterhood, cousinhood, whatever it is, into greater practice. And curiously and interestingly enough, we have our own typology. We have a very elaborate and really very interesting teaching of psychological types, which is called the 7 rays. And it requires, I think, some insightful study. In part, in the light of psychology, it could be very, very useful to us in that respect. That is another great myth in its own right, which could be very useful. The first, second, and third ray. are a sort of primal expression of the center of one's being, and they have to do sort of with the higher analogues of will, feeling, and thinking. They are the source rays, so to say. The other four that come after that are very similar to, very analogous to the four functions of consciousness and the types based thereon by Jung. One has to do with feeling, devotion as they often call it, and so forth. One has to do with thinking, science and all of that. One has to do with intuition and thereby with art and artistic creativity. And the seventh ray has to do with sensation, but in the theosophical scheme in a very sort of synthesizing ultimate expression, so that you can also see the seven rays starting with one, going to seven, starting with a very subtle, concentrated power of consciousness being not the first ray, will, and the last of the seventh ray is the expression of that will through the entire spectrum in physicality, in physical action. So if somebody wants to make a correlation, then they can take the seventh, the sixth, the fifth, and the fourth ray as really corresponding to the four principal Jungian functional types, and add the other three as a kind of a prototype of a more subtle nature, the first three rays. There's a definite relationship between the Jungian types and the ones that Theosophy has, and it needs some explanation and some understanding. And they are 7 ways of viewing reality, 7 ways of relating to the center, to the central reality. And no doubt they complement and supplement each other, but it stands to reason that in any given incarnation at any given time, an individual will have a main, a principal way whereby it's the easiest for such a person to deal with reality. And that when there are a number of people around who see reality in different ways, they are also likely to clash. And Theosophists are probably noted to be opinionated even more than a lot of other people, just because I think their psyches are energized by all of these activities.
But these concepts then might be very useful for a person when they're trying to deal with this dark internal period, and the fact to find out what is the way that's easiest for them. That might be a way to help them do the transformation.
Yes, and also I think by understanding what is the nature of conflict in life and with other people, which is a great conundrum of our lives. Why must there be conflict, and what is really the nature and the origin of such conflict? And instead of rationalizing the conflict in terms of, well, that's my karma, or something of that sort. And conflict can be creative conflict as well. Let's say when people of a different ray interact without fighting too much, they can stimulate the corresponding ray in each other, and they can contribute to the enrichment of each other's consciousness. Much conflict is creative conflict. But there is some conflict that is just destructive conflict. And usually it's up to us whether our conflicts are going to be creative and the results of them will be an enrichment of some sort of consciousness, or whether they will just be destructive. It's another frequent misunderstanding. Just no conflict, peace, 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 shanti, shanti, shanti. Just forget about all conflict. That is not really the way consciousness grows in the alchemical cauldron of life. It does grow by conflict. Yeah. But of course there is also the peace that passeth understanding, that pertains to a higher level of consciousness, to which we occasionally also stretch forth our, our human personality and get some of that higher peace.
Those same aspects as we see in the 7 rays, different personality types, in sort of traditional myths would be seen as different characters, right? Different people or animals or mythic situations the hero meets along the way.
Yeah, they would be, no doubt, they would be personified in
Yeah.
various characters. Just what we always need to remember is, of course, that in the myth, as I'm sure we have mentioned before, we are not dealing, if that bad pun may be permissible, these are not his story, they are our story, not history. Therefore, we always need to recognize that these various individuals, characters, animals, dragons, whatever the case may be, exist within ourselves. They have a corresponding reality, a corresponding principle within us, and therefore we can apply these mythologems to ourselves.
I'm reminded as you speak of Mabel Cullen's Light on the Path, where she talks about remembering that before we finish this journey, we're going to pass through all places, foul and clean alike,
Yes.
and that not to push anyone aside, not to, no man's your friend, no man's your enemy, all your teachers. This is another way of saying the same process of accepting, looking for differences, and working towards an integration, I think you would
Yes,
call it.
however, I think we need to always keep in mind a very important keynote. It may not be always represented under that same term in the theosophical literature, but it's certainly present there. That is that our experience has to be conscious. We have to be aware.
Right.
Just acceptance at a kind of unconscious level doesn't do us a great deal of good. But we have to be aware, we have to use all the powers of our awareness, of our consciousness to truly, well, in the vernacular we might say, zero in on this condition and understand it. Its nature, its meaning, the role that it is destined to play in our lives and in our development. Otherwise, experience needs to repeat itself over and over again without any disclosing any meaning.
So the awareness and the acceptance, the two, the consciousness of it, are what takes us from the troubled coming to the wonder.
To the wonder or the marvel. Now, the very word marvel, I think, is a very wonderful translation because it relates to marvelous, it relates to miracle. We come to a sort of reverent wonder, a reverent awe over the grandeur, the magnificence, the meaningfulness of it all. But not in a cheap sort of a way, by evading issues, but rather by following the issues to their root and perceiving that greater reality out of which they come and within which they really exist. So it's an exercise in consciousness, in the development of consciousness. The journey of the hero in the theosophical myth is a journey of consciousness, in the sense also of being conscious and moving from one level of development, one stage of the journey to the other.
And this consciousness is what leads to the transcendence, which is the wonder, is that?
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
And then, of course, there arises a higher state of consciousness, which is filled with just that kind of wonder.
Okay. You mentioned something about becoming the master and ruler, and that was analogous to the myth of Pan, I think you said?
Well, all. I mean, the phrase in the Gospel of Thomas says, then he will be a master, or we have rule over the all. And the all in Greek is Pan. And Pan was also regarded as the god of nature and sort of the embodiment of the physical and the instinctual universe. So that is the time when we become really superior to, and we are able to, by having risen above it, we are able to see the workings of the natural order and still live within them without having to necessarily leave them. But we are no longer enslaved and terrified by them. You know, the word panic is derived from Pan. Yeah, because people said that when the power of nature is, when we confront the power of nature, we are filled with a terrible, awful terror. So this is the only time when we no longer panic, when we are confronted with the world and with nature, because we have developed a consciousness that allows us to rise above it and at the same time function within it without losing ourselves.
And at that level we may see the order, we may know the order, not see it, be one with the order in a sense. Okay, well, with those statements of yours, we seem to kind of have completed the hero's journey as described in the St. Thomas quote. There are some questions I'd like us to consider before we end. One is, there's been this, we talked about it yesterday, this sort of current interest in mythology, and people talking about it and excited about it, perhaps for the first time in a long time in this culture. And people have questioned whether it really is inherent in the Theosophical tradition, or is this something that we've added on to? Is it part of us, or is it just are we sort of riding the popular bandwagon?
I think once again, if we look into the statements of H.P. Blavatsky, both the explicit and the implicit evidence is there, and in later theosophical teachings too, that even as I think we quoted at another time where H.P.'s statement that myth was the primary way in which spiritual truths were expressed in and since, we might say, archaic times, and that therefore the value and the importance of myth was always present within the theosophical system. It may be true that at certain times it was emphasized more than in other times, and we need to remember, after all, that Theosophy did not start in 1875, and no one would be a fiercer defender of that proposition than dear old H.P. Blavatsky herself. If this is really the ageless wisdom, then in short order it leads us back to those times when myths were of tremendous importance and were the primary ways of communicating spiritual truths. The difficulty that we possibly face is that within the certain period of theosophical history in the 19th century and the early 20th century was actually one of those very few historical periods when the understanding and the appreciation of myth, at least in our culture, was at a low ebb. And so many theosophical statements which are really mythic in character were often expressed as, quote, teaching, as fact. But that does not take away by any means their mythic nature and their mythic character. So I don't think that we are currying favor with some kind of a current fad when we are trying to mythologize, as it were, our concepts, but that we are indeed acting in the spirit of the ageless wisdom, which is to a very large extent and always has been and always will be mythological in character.
Yeah. Partly, I think you've said before that the reason it is mythological is because those are eternal and everything else, all the expressions of it, are transitory.
Facts change.
Right.
But a few short weeks ago, let's say, it was a fact that the Eastern Bloc countries were firmly in the grip of the Marxist ideology. And that fact had changed very greatly in just a few weeks' time. All facts change. But the myth and the message that the myth tells is timeless and therefore eternal.
The other question then, and I think we've referred to it over and over in our discussions, but it is another accusation that's sometimes leveled at myth, that it is very abstract, that these gods and goddesses or these mythical beings have nothing to do with us. And I think you've been saying that it's quite the contrary, right?
This is, of course, where we need to take into account and need to study the approach to mythology that particularly has arisen, that we mentioned, I think, in our last segment of the film, the approach to myth that has arisen, probably sort of since the 1930s and 40s, and has been going on since then, represented by such people as Jung and Heinrich Zimmer and Karl Kerényi and others and Joseph Campbell, which inevitably interprets the myth as being descriptive of the internal processes, the personal life of the individual. When we see the various mythologems as existing within ourselves and as denoting various transformations and movements of our own being and of our own soul. So when we fight the dragon, we fight the the evil and the darkness and the shadow within ourselves. When we find the Holy Grail, it's not out in the outer world so much as we find it as within ourselves. But that effort must be made to understand this as existing within ourselves. But that's of course difficult to do. You are probably familiar with that Hindu story from some Puranic verse or scripture, wherein the high gods at the beginning of creation wanted to hide, conceal the great treasure of life, of meaning, sort of a holy grail, so that the human might not find it right away. And when one suggested to put it in the depths of the sea, and the other said, well, he's going to dive there and find it, and put it on the high mountain, he's going to find it there. Put it in outer space, he's going to find the ways of going there and finding it. Finally, the wisest one said, put it right within himself. That's the last place where he's going to look for it. Yeah. So the myth, however, when properly understood, is by no means abstract. It's not just a story over there, but it is the highway that leads within ourselves. The hero's journey is to oneself, to one's true and authentic self. And that is why I think in the notion that we ought to learn how to look upon the various theosophical ideas in mythic terms is a very well advised one. And if indeed such developments are occurring in the outer world at the present time, well, that's just all to the good. That will be of great assistance to us, and we should welcome that and not just look upon it as some kind of a passing fad of the world, but try to see how this can also work for us.
I think you said earlier that the theosophical myth, in a sense, is saying, as you said, walk on, keep moving, always go deeper, not rest in your belief, that those are the essential elements in using our day-to-day experience as the method of doing this? Is that a fair way of putting it?
Oh yes, absolutely. I think that the underlying keynote of the theosophical myth is the transformative growth of consciousness by way of an ongoing movement. And so even as the transformation or growth of consciousness was not arrested and stopped in Atlantis or whatever that may mean or so forth, but that it keeps on going and it's moving on to the next root race, our books say, and all of that, it is considered a grave danger if Kundalini is stopped at some particular chakra. In the same way, we should not allow the progress of our consciousness to be arrested, for instance, by belief. Even when that belief is a good belief, even when that belief is helpful, even if it is a theosophical belief, we ought to penetrate to a level that is deeper than belief, and not necessarily abandoning these beliefs altogether, but trying to see the deeper dimensions, and the mythic approach, I think, can be a very great assistance in that regard. If the question be asked now, not so much just of the individual member, but let's say of the role of the Theosophical movement, of the Theosophical Society itself, I would say that the movement, which is composed of members, of course, but the movement itself, as much as possible, should be aware of the fact that it is the guardian of an ageless stream of tradition, and that it is not bound to the formulation of the 19th century or the early 20th century, but that we must engage in a reappraisal, reformulation, a kind of transvaluation, as the existentialists would put it often, of our theosophical concepts. And in doing so, we will keep them alive as well as our own soul alive. Otherwise, we will increasingly become a kind of a relic, venerable relic, no doubt, at least I feel so, of an earlier era of the alternative tradition, and we will pass into the mists of time, as I don't know, the alchemists have, or the early ceremonial magicians, or the hermeticists and so forth, who have represented the alternative tradition wonderfully at some time in history, but then passed out of history. I don't think that we need to do that, at least not yet. But we have to be alert and keep the tradition moving, even as we keep ourselves moving. I think that, in a sense, our theosophical tradition is a metaphor for our own souls, and our soul is a metaphor for that tradition. We need to keep moving, we need to keep transforming, we need to move into deeper and greater areas of consciousness and recognition, and not resist the good things that come along in the world and say, oh, well, there's this Joseph Campbell and people like that, and they want to make a myth out of everything, but we know better, we know facts, you know. But let us see what these people are trying to do, and usually we will see that that is something that Theosophists in their own way have been trying to do all along, and we are not betraying our tradition by doing that also ourselves.
I was thinking that you often talk on the other side of that as well, that we don't want to trivialize it, get so wrapped up in current fads that we...
Oh, absolutely.
Maybe the difference between what you said the other night about folklore and myth, that you have to keep it deep.
Well, now that's an important issue once again. I don't know to what extent we have explored that before. There is myth and myth. Not all myths are of equal power and of equal value, and that to a very large extent has to do with the fact as to whether a particular myth is close to experience. If it's experiential in its origin, and that experience is not too remote in the past, that gives the myth a much greater force, a much greater power, and those are the myths perhaps that are preferable to others. There is just a kind of old folklore that still has a lot of valuable elements in it, but that works at a rather low level. Carigny, the mythologist, had said, for instance, that the mythic statements and philosophical statements of the Neoplatonists and of the Gnostics had a great primal power because they were so close to experience. And I think the current interest in shamanism also has a lot to do with that, because the shaman always goes back to experience. You haven't found too many shamans who write 15-volume philosophical tomes about their shamanism. They go back to experience again and again, and therefore their myths are often very close to experience and feel very powerful and very alive. So we need to develop a little discrimination among myths also, as in everything else.
We're about to stop. Is there anything we've missed in these two conversations that you would like to add before we finish?
I'm sure that we missed a great deal, but I can't really think of any particular element, except perhaps to say that the Theosophia, the wisdom of the gods, has always been so constituted that the story and the nature of the gods could never be comprehended in a prosaic, declarative, factual language. The gods have always been described in myths. That seems to be their habitat. That's the Mount Olympus. The myth is the residence of the gods. And if we are really practitioners of the Theosophia, the wisdom of the gods, then we have to learn the language of the gods, which is the language of myth, much more than the language of mere factual, quasi-scientific or quasi-historical description, to which we have been so often confined. And so we need not be afraid of such statements as karma or reincarnation or evolution are a myth, because that merely shows us a deeper dimension of their veracity and does not really take away from their validity at all.
Thank you very much.
You're so welcome.